Hi, welcome to Food Sleuth TV and radio. My name is Melinda Hemmelgarn, registered dietitian, and I have a fantastic guest with me today, Vera Massey, who is a nutritionist with the University of Missouri Extension. I've known you for decades.
Oh, yes.
So you're also a really great friend. But you have a master's degree in food science and nutrition.
Yes.
And so you understand how a person might preserve food and how a person could actually kill someone if they're not preserving food correctly, right?
Yes.
I told you when I invited you on the show, I said, you know, there are 50 ways to make apple pie, but there's only one way to can food correctly.
Yes, indeed. Yes, indeed.
Okay, so what we want to do today is we want to talk about food preservation. It is, you know, 20, 30 years ago, we were answering questions about food preservation, and then it sort of died.
Yes.
Because we went to the processed food.
Mm-hmm.
And now people are feeling like, you know what, I want to have that sense of control over my food again. I want to grow my food again, and then what do we do with the harvest?
Right.
Right?
And you know, probably years ago, people primarily preserved food because of economics.
Right.
That it was cheaper, but as our food supply is still one of the cheapest in the world, we've relied on processed foods. So it's not so much the economics anymore that I find when I talk to people. It's a lot about that personal satisfaction, wanting to have some sense of control over what's in that jar or that package. And, you know, it builds, I think, confidence in a lot of people.
I do too.
That it's like, I can do this. I've grown it, or I've gone to the market,
Right.
and then I'm going to extend this food to enjoy, whether it's in a canned form or frozen form or maybe in a dried form, and it's going to taste a little different.
Right. You know, I remember 2 years ago, I had a bumper crop of tomatoes, and you came over and
Yes,
you
I
helped
remember
me
that.
can my tomatoes. And then last year, and I don't know, what do we have, 40 quarts? We had a tremendous number. But last year, my tomatoes didn't produce, and I was so happy that I still had quarts of tomatoes on my shelf. And when I took them off the shelf, I knew they had never been sprayed with a pesticide. I didn't have to pay an arm and a leg for a processed organic product. They were organic from my garden, and you helped me through the process. And it's, you know, I don't want to say that it's easy. I think it's one of those things where you have to do it often to
Right.
get the hang of it. But at the end of the day, it was like, wow, I've got all this food.
It's a great sense of accomplishment, and I actually started preserving foods, as I tell people, when I was about 3 years old, sitting in the kitchen with my grandmother and my mother, and they were making applesauce, and they had a colander, and I remember they were doing something, and after the apples came out, I decided to put it on my head, and it got stuck. And so I always say my first time in canning was with the colander stuck on my head, and it's like I've been doing it off and on for over 50 years now.
Wow.
And so it started even as a 4-H'er, and the changes that you've seen, even in what we've learned, you know, food preservation is research-based.
Right.
And so there are reasons why we handle foods in certain ways, particularly when it comes to canning,
Right.
because we have the risk of botulism, which is something that as long as we're following research-based techniques, no worries.
Right.
But what we find is that we have all these new people entering this world of food preservation, and we have access to the internet where anything can be posted.
Right.
We could be using techniques that may not provide a safe food or quality food. And so getting that research-based information, checking it out before we decide to do it, because as you know, it's time-consuming.
It is.
It is not, but it is worth it.
Right.
I find it's worth it, and most people that do food preservation do. But you want to make sure that you're doing it right so that you don't have to call someone like me and say, I have 30 quarts of green beans and they're bubbling.
Yeah.
And so then you have to start asking the questions, well, how did you process it?
Right.
And then some people might say, process it? I just heated it up and put some lids on.
Right.
And so then it's sort of going back and helping educate people.
But what a waste.
It's a waste. It's costly, the time.
Right.
The time and the expense, because
Yes.
preserving foods, there are expenses associated with it. But again, for many people, the trade-off is worth it.
Yeah.
because they have that sense of control. And the thing about even with canning, which is probably the most time consuming, you need the most background before you get started.
Right.
Many of those supplies, the jars and the rings, they can be reused if they're handled properly, and the equipment you purchase can last for years.
Right. Well, okay, so we should start with, let's look at the different forms of food preservation. Would you say the easiest is probably freezing?
Absolutely. And you know, most people freeze foods in some form.
Right.
It could just be taking some leftovers and freezing it.
Right, right.
But we think about handling produce from, say, the summer and fall months. We're actually going to take that fresh food and have to take a few more steps than just freezing the leftovers.
Right,
So
right.
if it's vegetables per se, let's say broccoli,
Sure.
spinach. With vegetables, we want to stop the enzymes that are in food that do great things for food. It produces a wonderful color and texture and flavor. But if we let that broccoli or spinach stay out there, eventually it starts to deteriorate. It spoils.
Right.
So part of the food preservation is you stop the enzymes at that peak quality when we've harvested it so that we have the great color, the great texture, the great flavor.
Now, I'm going to ask you a technical question, and I'll confess that I probably do things wrong. But, you know, I'm sort of like, I take the lazy man's approach to freezing, not to canning, to freezing. And everybody says, oh, yeah, you should blanch those tomatoes before you put them in the bag. And you know what I do? I take them from the garden, I wash them off, I dry them, I put them in a Ziploc bag, I put them in the freezer. I take them out when it's time to make sauce, mildly defrosted, put them in the processor. Is that bad?
Probably not so much. I think some vegetables, the nutrients, you could preserve a lot more. I'm thinking broccoli, for instance.
Right, right.
If you just took and harvested broccoli, because of the texture and the composition, and you put it in a bag, it would probably be very tough and stringy. Tomatoes, because they have a much higher water content,
Sure.
they're going to sort of just cook down anyway. And most of the way you're going to use those tomatoes is not going to be putting it on a salad.
Okay, exactly.
You're going to be cooking it.
Right.
And so something like a broccoli or even taking spinach and trying to freeze it without blanching, I think you're not going to be as happy with the quality. But I think tomatoes are a little different.
Okay, good.
You wouldn't,
Phew.
and you would, yeah, don't worry. You wouldn't worry either about, say, onions. You know, you're not going to blanch onions.
Right.
You chop the onions, put them in a freezer bag. And you know, that's a really important thing to preserve the quality, is we have what we call storage bags
Right.
and freezer bags.
Right.
And when you go to the store and you look at them, they appear to be the same. But a freezer bag is moisture vapor resistant, so that means it's going to keep the air out.
Right.
And
They're thicker.
they're thicker.
They're sturdier.
They're sturdier, and you have less problems with freezer burn.
Right.
So if you're going to freeze and keep things for a longer period of time, you want to have a freezer bag. And always, the whole key about preserving foods is getting the air out. So even if you've got the frozen tomatoes, press the air out before you seal it up.
Okay.
Because air in it, you have trapped that in there, and the quality is not going to be as good.
So it's all about preserving the nutrients, the taste,
The taste
and
safety.
safety.
Safety's a bigger issue probably when it comes to canning, which we can get into that. But with freezing, we still want the food to be clean.
Right, right.
And handling it, choosing foods that you harvest and move into the food preservation process quickly. For instance, tomatoes, if they've been harvested and then they've set for a week, they may
Yeah.
not be the best to
Right.
use to preserve. We have sort of this little saying, 2 hours from garden to jar.
Oh, really?
Or to
Oh, I
the
gotta write that
freezer.
down.
And you know, in some instances that's possible and others not. But you know that the peak quality is after it's freshly harvested.
You're
so
right.
if you have your own garden, you can make that happen.
Yeah.
You can go to the farmer's market, and most of those vendors have harvested probably within a few hours.
Right.
But the longer a food sort of sets after harvest, you start having some quality start
Right.
declining. So you want to have it at peak. You know, the other thing when we think about freezing, while it is easy, the variety makes a difference for some things. Some peas and some green beans freeze better than others.
Yeah.
But what we find is that probably what most people freeze are tomatoes,
Right.
because they may not want to go through all the steps of canning.
Right.
And they'll freeze things like maybe herbs. and
Do you have to
onions.
blanch those before you freeze them?
I think you're fine. Typically, I find just drying herbs.
Right.
Or you can simply chop them up and freeze them in little ice cube trays.
Oh, yeah.
And
With
then you
water?
Can, the little water, and then freeze them and then pop them out and put them in a freezer bag. And so not very much water, but just some. And then you can pop them into a soup.
Oh, that's a great idea.
Right.
And that preserves the quality better because
Yes,
it keeps
and
the
color.
oxygen out.
Yes, yes.
Oh.
Many times with fish, we talk about to freeze fish
Right.
in water helps.
Right.
So there are lots of little tips as far as freezing goes, but you know what? If I was starting out, that's where I'd start first. The big thing we have to keep in mind, though, is that if you don't have a freezer,
Right.
then don't get into freezing for long term, because a lot of the freezers over the top of a refrigerator, many of them kind of cycle in and out, and they don't always maintain that 0 degrees consistently.
Right.
And that's the other thing, Melinda, is I have a freezer refrigerator thermometer. I think every person needs one of these in their freezer, 0 degrees or below.
Okay.
And during food preservation season, if you are opening that door a lot and you're freezing lots of tomatoes and perhaps some peaches, I would say run that freezer a little below 0.
And that's for quality, right? Not
Quality.
necessarily for safety.
Well, for safety too. You want that 0 degrees or lower.
Okay.
And for the refrigerator, I say run it around 35, 38.
Okay.
Because again, in the summer months, we're in and out a lot. And
Right.
it warms up a little quicker. But sometimes people will call when their freezer's gone off. And so then you have to help determine, is this safe to use? And I'll usually say, do you happen to know what the temperature was in the freezer when
Right.
you opened it? No.
Right.
So having a refrigerator freezer thermometer, they're inexpensive, and then you can monitor that.
That's great advice. You know, the other day we had a horrible storm and our electricity went out for overnight. And the first thing I thought of was, I'm so glad I have canned food on my shelf, because what if the electricity didn't come back on? And
Right.
all of that food would spoil. So we should probably then move into the joys of food preservation with regard to canning.
Canning, absolutely. And you know, many people are afraid to can.
Yeah, I would say that, you know, when I was first married, my husband and I canned, and then I sort of took a little hiatus when the kids were young. I didn't want to have a lot of big pots of boiling water. And then, as you know, I called you to help me in my kitchen, my food coach. But it is scary to get started with it.
And what I say is start with a water bath method first.
Okay.
We have two types of canning. We have water bath canning and pressure canning.
Okay, and I'm
And
just
let's
going to
just
look at
talk
this
with the-
pot.
that's the
okay,
water bath.
This is a water bath. It's just a big pot that holds boiling water. And it has a
Yes.
rack in the bottom to hold jars.
Right, and the way we determine which method we use is foods that are of higher acid. We can use a water bath, which we achieve 212 degrees, which will kill the yeast, molds, and bacteria that would grow in an acid food.
Spoilage organisms.
Spoilage organisms, and so we can use that water bath canner for things like pickles. While the cucumber or vegetables are low acid, they have a high percentage of vinegar,
Right.
which makes them acid. Then we can use a water bath canner. Things like a jam or jelly, high sugar concentration, acid, they can be water bathed. We have fruits, applesauce, fruit juices. Tomatoes are the ones that sort of fall in that in-between stage, and botanically, they are fruit. We consider them as a vegetable. So we have recommendations for using a water bath canner or a pressure canner for tomatoes, but either way, we say to people, acidify.
Okay.
Add citric acid or lemon juice. And again, you know, we can talk later and give a site where they can
Great,
get all
yes.
the materials. Because what we need to do is when we start canning or really any preservation is get printed materials that you're familiar with and you can go back and check because
Well,
the
we should-
timetables vary.
We should talk about that site. That is is it the Center for Food
The
Safety?
National Center for Home Food Preservation. And this particular site is an amazing site. It's part of the cooperative extension through USDA, funded at the University of Georgia. And Elizabeth Andrus, who's
Right.
like the queen of
She
food
is the
preservation.
queen.
I'm the princess.
Right,
She's
right.
the queen of food preservation.
right.
And it is where they do a lot of research. And their website is amazing.
And you said they have like little YouTube videos?
They have videos on how to can certain things. They have slideshows. So if you're that kind of learner, you can go through and go through step by step and learn all the research background to preserving foods.
So people don't have to remember everything we're saying. We're going to give them
and
a
they
site.
have recipes. All of the recipes on there are tested. The thing we have to be concerned about when we can is that we don't know what the pH is. So we've researched it, and when we talk about putting a certain amount of food or handling food a certain way, the timetables are based for that specific way.
Right.
So you don't start changing it and say, oh, I think I'll do my tomato sauce a different way.
Right.
That's great if you want to freeze it. And I'll tell you what, things like salsa where everybody has their own little special recipe,
Right.
if it's not a tested recipe, freeze it.
Okay.
If you want to can salsa, use a tested recipe because when you start making salsa, you're putting in maybe garlic and peppers and all these wonderful things, which are
But
great
low
to eat
acid.
but low acid. So we want to use a tested recipe, and you will find hundreds of recipes
Wow.
at this National Center for Home Food Preservation
All tested
site.
for safety.
All tested for safety. Plus, they will also have links to other leading universities where in certain locales, for instance in California, they may have other foods that aren't as prevalent here.
Right.
But you can go in and see what those states are saying through their extension services.
right.
So you have, you can tap into many different resources through that one site.
Okay, and we will make sure to get that posted on a slide. But if somebody wanted to just Google it, it's the National Center for Home Food Preservation.
Yes. Well,
Right.
yes. Yes. Just type in National Center for Home Food Preservation, and that's going to take you to a University of Georgia website.
Perfect.
It's
Okay,
excellent.
that's all people need to know.
So, you know, going back, when we started talking about that water bath canner.
Right. For the acidic foods.
Right.
The
foods that are-
safe, because acid equals safe.
Yes.
Okay.
Acid allows us to use a water bath. But when we start going to a low acid food like vegetables,
Right.
meats, fish, some people are into doing that.
Right.
Then we want to use a pressure canner.
And that scares a lot of people,
it
including
does
me.
scare. I hope this is going to
You know,
work.
what do people think about? They think, oh my God, it's going to blow up.
And you know, I have a great deal of respect for a pressure canner. I started when I was young, and I remember that being drilled into me. You don't have to be afraid of it, but just follow the directions and treat it with
Right.
respect. Don't try to rush it along. Don't decide, oh, I want to cool it off quick.
Right.
And do something that could be really risky. But a pressure canner allows us to achieve a higher temperature than 212 degrees that you achieve in a water bath. Because with a low acid food, you have the potential, if the Clostridium botulinum bacteria is present,
And that's deadly bacteria,
that's
I might
deadly,
add, right?
deadly.
Okay.
Then you want, in order to destroy any spores that could be present, because they're in the ground, but they don't cause a
Right.
problem. It's only when you trap them in a low, no oxygen environment, you leave them at a nice room temperature,
Right.
you have food,
Yes.
and they like low acid food,
Right.
then that's when they can grow and develop if they have not been destroyed.
And that is the deadliest one, isn't it?
It is, and it's not the bacteria, it is the toxin that the spores
Right.
that grow and they generate that. And the toxin, I mean, a milligram can kill, I think I read 60,000 mice or something.
Well, you know, I remember years ago, you brought these wonderful cans of carrots in, or jars, we call them cans, but they're actually jars of carrots that had been canned. I remember years ago reading about a woman who incorrectly canned carrots and ended up, I think she died. Either that or she was on a ventilator for months in the hospital.
Because it affects your respiratory system.
Right,
You know,
right.
other types of food poisoning many times are GI tract.
Yes.
But usually with a botulism, it affects your respiratory system and your heart.
Right.
And it can be quite deadly. But we don't have to worry about botulism if we just remember that our low acid foods must be canned in a pressure canner. Sometimes I'll have people say, well, I just can my green beans in a water bath canner.
Right.
And you have to say, well, and they ask, well, how long do I boil them? And so I say, well, what's the highest temperature you can reach? 212. Well, it takes 240 to destroy the Clostridium botulinum bacteria, the spores. And the only way you achieve that is through steam heat.
Wow, okay.
And so with a pressure canner, what you're able to achieve is, and a very important step in using a pressure canner is to exhaust the air out before you put on the weight.
But I can go to this National Center for Home Food Preservation, and I can understand, like, well, what do you mean by exhausting there? And they'll show me visually.
They'll show you that.
Okay.
And I think they also have a great book. This is my Bible for food preservation.
This is great.
It's actually called So Easy to Preserve, and you can see I have it marked. I use this all the time.
Right.
But every aspect of food preservation is covered. While through the University of Missouri, which I represent, we have many guide sheets that are good.
Right.
And you can get those at no charge. You can download them. We can send them to you. What I really like about this is it's all together in a book for me.
Right.
And it offers probably more than what our guides have. And so again, this can be ordered at that National Center site.
So if a person was going to get into this, they really do need to have a good guide that they can keep on their shelf and make it their own.
Right.
They can write in there, liked this, didn't like that.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And these are all based with research-based work.
Right, right.
So, and sometimes you'll find recipes in magazines that may not even talk about preserving. They just talk about heating it and put a lid on, and be very cautious. The one thing that I wanted to mention, and I haven't actually bought them in store, but you're going to start seeing these one-piece lids.
Oh, yeah.
And I'm getting a lot of calls from people because they'll find them when they purchase this in the section where we have what we recommended, the two-piece, because the whole principle behind a two-piece lid is in order to preserve something, you've got to get rid of the air.
Right.
And so the only way that you can do this is a two heating. This little lid is giving, and you're exhausting the air out. There's no way in home food preservation you can exhaust a one-piece lid.
They ought to make that illegal to sell those.
And you know what I discovered is I saw them last year, but if you read the label, they were in the canning section, but if you read closely, storage lids.
Oh, yeah.
But if you're new to food preservation, you wouldn't know.
Right.
Well,
and that's ridiculous. I mean, you can use old jars for storage jars. You don't need to buy a whole new set of storage jars.
I save, I wouldn't use this in my canner, but I can put leftovers in
sure.
here.
Yeah.
I can take some water out to the garden and drink. But when we get into
you don't
preserving,
have to buy anything fancy, though.
then you use jars that are heat tempered, that are designed for it. But these other jars that we purchase foods in, they can be used for storage.
I remember when I had been answering questions myself, and somebody called and said, "Can I reuse the lid?" No, cannot. These have to be bought new every year.
Yes, and what the reason why we want new lids each year is we have the sealing compound, and once this has been used,
that's it.
That's it.
Yeah.
And even if let's say you did a batch of carrots in the pressure canner, and let's say you had a jar or two that didn't seal for whatever reason, you would either, what I say, if it's only one or two, you let it cool, put it in the freezer, store it that way, because otherwise you would have to can it over the whole entire process.
That's
then
a
you
really
got a
good
new
point.
flat. And really at that point, I would say take it out of the jar, put it in a freezer bag or container. Even though these jars are designed for freezing and canning purposes, I'm kind of, I don't do well with glass and freezers personally. I would rather use a plastic, but you could freeze it as long as you have enough headspace.
I do freeze things in my freezer in glass. But I have to say, the thing to be really careful of is to make sure you've got the headspace, and also when you take it out, don't
hit it.
don't run it under hot water and create that big temperature change.
Yes.
Just maybe cool it first with put some cold water on it, and then maybe microwave it. Rather than microwaving in plastic, which we never want to do.
Exactly. But with canning, there's lots of steps, and we can't get into all of that.
Right.
And that's, you know, I'll be teaching some classes that are actually going to be coming up soon. And even if you can't attend those classes, you can go onto that site and learn. You can also contact me, and I can help you think through some of those things.
It helps to have a visual display. It helps to be able to watch somebody do it and say, okay, I can mimic that. I think most of us are visual learners anyway, but it's nice to know, you know, about the kinds of equipment I'm going to need and all of the benefits associated with it. You know, when we first started out, you said something really great, and it was that, you know, all we need is good food and love. In terms of, we were talking about how do we solve all the world's problems. And I think that, you know, the food that we get from our own garden, first of all, you know, it's a package of seeds, and then bingo, for people who are really struggling with the economy, to grow more of our own food, but then also to harvest and preserve it is just fantastic. The other thing that I wanted to ask you about was, how do people, you know, you talk to people who have been preserving for many years. What kind of things do they tell you about the whole process? Do they ever get comfortable with using a pressure canner? And you know, what do they tell you?
I think for the most part, people that have been doing it a long time, many of them sort of grew up with it, sort of like I did.
Right.
I was introduced to it at a very early age. I guess they were doing it right because we never had a problem.
Right.
But I hear people that will say, oh, it blew up at my grandmother's. If that fear was ever instilled at an early age, then it's really hard to overcome that. But I think for newer people who have not done it, and then they come to a workshop, and I think workshops where you really just get to have hands-on and actually see it. And that's what's so good about the site we talked about. At least you have pictures to watch a real person doing it. It's not just reading it out of the book.
And I also like the idea of doing it together so that it becomes a social event.
Absolutely, absolutely. And it is also just a way, I think, for children, for me growing up, knowing that we were self-sufficient. My mother, who's into her 70s now, you go into her basement and she has jars of canned food items. And she grew up in the Depression, which canning was a very important part, but just to know that I can survive if I am not able to get to the store, or in some parts of the state where they've had ice storms. And without electricity for a week or 10 days. Absolutely. And I think children can learn. Children can be involved in very simple steps. Snapping the green beans and shelling the peas. And I mean, those are wonderful times that bring families together. That everyone can have their own little job.
You know, I love that, and that's how we'll end. We'll end on that note of a way to bring a family together around the table with home preserved food is just fantastic. Thank you so much for being here today and helping us sort of get through, you know, the transition from gardener to food preserver. Thank you so much, and thanks so much for listening.